The following video has been rated PG-13 for, it's pretty good, if you're 13. It's boring!
Everywhere you look, you still see the signs. It's October in Orlando. Which means that we're still filming Mysteries of Orlando. It's time. Part 3. But unlike the last couple weeks, we're in a little bit of a more inconspicuous area on the corner of Michigan and Fern Creek. Hello, my friends. It is I, your Uncle Splorin Ryan, joining us today as we hit our third Mystery in Orlando series, Adventures by George.
Hi, everybody.
Also, Greg's Game Room.
Yes, Greg's Game Room on YouTube.
You've subscribed, right?
Subscribe now.
Subscribe now. We're coming to you from an interesting location this time. We're at Johnny's Filling Station, which is home of Orlando's best burger. At least so the story goes. We're gonna have a little nosh, and then we're gonna go across the street. Today, as we do, just a little Splorin. We finished the burger. Burger was pretty darn good. Johnny's Filling Station over there. Definitely give it a shot if you're in the area. But now it's time to get down to business. Coming out and going right across the street. Well, we've arrived at our destination for tonight. Big, beautiful field right across the street from Johnny's. And like, you know, most other big towns, there's just these big open fields all over the place, but this one's a little bit different. Taking a look behind us, looks the same. There's some trees, some unfortunate trash laying around, but it's not really what we see that's bringing us here tonight. Rather, it's what we don't see, and nobody has for years. The three folks behind me, Super Enthused, Tampa Jay, Adventures by George. We were here to grab a little bite to eat before we came over here to do a little bit exploring. I haven't really told them what we're doing out here. What we're doing here at Orange Hill Cemetery. It's a cemetery, folks. This isn't just any cemetery either. This is a pauper's field. This cemetery has not been used since 1948. And just to the right of us, there are 522 people, none of which do we know the names of. Wow. Orange Hill Cemetery was placed here as one of the earliest cemeteries in Orlando. This was, as I mentioned, a pauper's field. And a pauper's field, if you aren't familiar with it, is a cemetery that they bring people who were too poor to afford a proper funeral, or whose families abandoned them, for people who they could not identify. And unfortunately, there are 522 residents of Orlando who are buried right behind us in this field, where if you look across, there are no headstones and there are very few markers. In fact, from here you can't even see the markers. There are no trespassing signs up all over the place, which are meant to keep people from coming out and disturbing the final resting places of these folks. 522 people, most of whom we don't know the names for. This cemetery is considered to be full. They stopped doing any burials in the late 1940s. In 1954, they came out and they did a bit of a survey. The government came in, did a survey, and that's where they came up with the roughly 522 number that they're using right now. There could be a few more. There could be a few less. Since then, in the 1960s, they opened a new cemetery called the Garden of Remembrance, which is up that way and around a little bit. It's near an active cemetery. There are some tombstones there. Most of them, unfortunately, they still don't know, so it's dates, not names. So the Orlando mystery is twofold tonight. It's what happened that this cemetery was forgotten, and it really was. It was forgotten for years. I mean, the the government of Orlando knew was here, but I mean, most people don't realize this is a cemetery. I mean, you look behind us, it's a Shell station and a Circle K. We don't know who's over here. Well, we know one person who was over here. In 1904, there was a man by the name of Hiram Calder that moved down here from Norfolk, Virginia, looking for the warmer temperatures and the prospects of a better life. This was the citrus world at the time, and he moved down here with his young wife, and they didn't really find a fortune. Instead, though, they found a job for Hiram at a bakery up the road, and his young wife, considerably younger than him, she was a stage actress, and she was fairly in demand at the time. She acted, and they cut out a nice little block for themselves for a little while. And as time went by, they carved out their nice little life here, and they were doing pretty well. Unfortunately, the young wife, whose name has been lost to the sands of time, she contracted an illness, typhoid, and she passed away. And it absolutely destroyed Mr. Calder. But very shortly before Mrs. Calder died, she got an acting job in Tampa. And actually, they moved to Tampa very briefly, so she could follow up on this acting job. And she was in the theater, and Tampa Jay here actually has done some great videos of these historical theaters in Tampa. Yeah. I'm going to have a link below where you can look at some of the theaters that we're talking about right here. And she did well, very briefly, and then she got sick. So Mr. Calder, in his grief after she passed away, he buried her in Tampa, and then he came back to Orlando. And he spent from 1911 to 1914 here in Orlando. And the people around here, they really respected Mr. Calder. They said he was extremely intelligent. The gentlemen at the time, they'd have the gentlemen's parlors and stuff like that, where they'd get together and they'd talk philosophy and they'd talk politics and finances. And he wasn't rich like the rest of them, but he really held his own, and they had a lot of respect for how intelligent he was up until about 1914. And unfortunately, in 1914, Mr. Calder too became ill. Mr. Calder ended up contracting an illness that was caused by a chronic lack of niacin in the diet, which is something that a lot of people who were poor at the time got, because they were eating a diet that was based largely on corn. And there's, the niacin deficiency would cause a level of, what you would now call senility, but in the time was considered to be insanity. And no longer able to care for himself, Mr. Calder was taken to the Orange County Home for the Indigent. And at his new dwelling, while working with his new doctor, they discovered something very interesting about Mr. Calder, and that is that Mr. Calder was in fact Miss Calder, and had always been Miss Calder. And that wife that we were talking about, that was her daughter. It appears that Hiram, or whatever Hiram's real name was, which again has been lost to the sands of time, actually gave birth to the young lady at the age of 14, and to hide the quote-unquote shame of a baby born out of wedlock, when the daughter was old enough, they began passing her off as the wife. She'd been acting from the age of 14, and because they jumped from town to town, they were able to pull it off. Wow. So after Hiram was discovered, Hiram died like 3 months later. And unfortunately, Hiram died pretty much penniless and ended up over here. Here in the Orange Hill Cemetery. Now, the residents of Orlando were kind of shocked to hear about this, and I assure you it made the papers after Hiram passed away. But Hiram was very well liked, and they took up a collection, and Hiram did not stay here for all that long. They took up a collection, and after a few years of being buried here at Orange Hill Cemetery, they took Hiram's body and they buried her next to her daughter in Tampa, where she still lies to this day. But more than the significance of just being a woman masquerading as a man, Hiram registered to vote as a man. This was years before the 9th Amendment, which means that Hiram was the first woman to vote in America, at least in Florida, that we know of.
That's so cool.
Wow. The Orlando Sentinel, which is actually still around right now, is a more progressive-leaning newspaper, and at the time, they actually published an article where they rather enthusiastically pointed out that a woman had voted in many elections, and yet somehow, democracy still stood. So while Hiram might not be here anymore, there are still 522 largely unidentified souls who consider this small 2-acre parcel of land on the corner of Michigan and Fern Creek to be their final resting place. Of course, being the month of October when we filmed this, I have to point out that there's a paranormal aspect to the cemetery as well. Actually, the tree right behind Greg is considered to be haunted. People have seen a white dress looking like it's hanging from the tree. And when they move across, usually they see it from the other side of the field, they move across to see what it is. And there is a shadowy mass that blocks their path. And usually they run, because, you know, let's say it's not a ghost, and something blocks your path in a cemetery, you run. I mean, you run.
Okay, now I'm getting scared.
Yeah. Of course, you put us right in front of the haunted tree.
Yeah.
And we didn't know.
Splorin. And so, from Orange Hill Cemetery here in Orlando, I thank you for joining us tonight as we do, once again, with Tampa Jay, Super Enthused, Adventures by George, and of course yours truly, just a little Splorin. Where something interesting was discovered. Mr. Calder.
I'm sorry, but I think that was a bat.
Where would it go? Yeah, we got bats here all the time.
That was freaking awesome.
There he is, right there.
Yep.
That's a bat.
That's a bat.